Hello, everyone. My name is Oğuz Karasu. I am one of the postdoctoral research fellows at the Said Business School under the Oxford Space Initiative. I'm mostly focusing on how the UK space ecosystem works and what is the economic impact of it. Before that, I studied the US space industry, and Professor Matthew Wenzel helped me about that too for a while. And today we are hosting him and Brandon Russo. So they are the authors of Space to Grow, which is going to be released soon, I believe, in February 2025. Don't forget to order from now. Let me briefly mention who is Matthew Mazer and also Brandon Russo. So Matthew is a senior associate dean and chair of the MBA program at Harvard Business School. His research focuses on the optimal design of economic policy, in particular taxation, with an emphasis of better understanding the philosophical principles underlying policy choices. But he is also doing research projects focused on the commercialization of the space sector and its economic implications. Brandon, I believe he worked with you for a while, at least 3-4 years, as a teaching fellow at the Harvard Business School. He was also part of the space research team, and I know that he has been doing some consultancy works at the various institutions. And so welcome both. And let me briefly mention what the Oxford Space Initiative, then I will leave the floor to Professor. Oxford Space Initiative is a group of people who are focusing on the social science perspective of the space economy, how it works in terms of business, economics, sociology, management perspective. And we are doing like research projects, some seminars just like this one, and also a couple of other programs related with that. We are also doing the MBA teaching week every year related it directly on space economy and policy. So let me leave the floor to Professor Matthew. Welcome again, and thanks for being here today. And please.
Great. Thanks so much, Oğuz. It's so great to be with all of you. And actually, I see some familiar names on the list of participants. So it's nice to see a few of you friends from years gone by. And what a great group for Brendan and I to be able to present to a group focused on the social science aspects of space. There aren't too many of us, as we know. And so it's a pleasure for us to have a chance to share some of our thinking with you. And, you know, as Oğuz mentioned, I teach at HBS, and we are a very interactive place. So I'm going to try to limit the amount of time that I spend just talking at you today, so we can have lots of good conversation. And in fact, I'll get you involved maybe in just a second, but I don't want to miss the opportunity. I think I'm going to try to share slides and see if they work here. Great, looks like it's going to work. Don't worry, we are definitely going to tell people how to pre-order the book. So there it is, right there on their first slide. This is the book, and you know, it's called Space to Grow, which has lots of different meanings. We can talk about why we chose that title, but Unlocking the Final Economic Frontier is the subtitle, and I think especially for this group, hopefully that's a resonant phrase. That's really how we think about what we're trying to help people do. And you know, Brendan and I would of course love to sell lots and lots of books, but not so much to sell the books, but to get the ideas out there. And I'm sure that's how all of us on this call feel. You know, as Oğuz mentioned, I'm trained as a tax theorist of all things. And when I started getting involved in space, the main reason I got involved in space was to try to help, basically. I just think the vision we have for what space might make possible is really inspiring. And I thought, is there a way as an economist that I can help achieve those visions? And so our goal really with the book is just to make whatever small contribution we can to helping people achieve those visions in the sector and beyond. And so, you know, please do get yourself a copy and recommend it to others. But let me just say a little bit more about the book, and then I'll get you guys involved in a conversation. So we really hope the book can serve as three different things. The first is as a framework, and that's really for folks like you and others who are involved in the sector and think a lot about it. our idea here is to bring to bear some basic tools, or you might say fundamental tools from economics, to give a different lens or a different framework on how to see what's happening in space, even for people who are deeply involved in it. Some of that will be more familiar even to this group than to other experts, but our sense is that there hasn't been that much social science brought to bear on what's happening, and so we're trying to help people see that. But the second purpose is what you might call a call to action for a broader group of people. Whether it's business leaders who don't think of themselves as in space companies or connected to space in any ways, or individuals who might start to imagine a future for themselves in the sector. We'd like to get them a feeling of urgency that this is the time when they can really get involved and really should get involved, in fact, even in a competitive sense. And then finally, it's an introduction for everyone. So I know I've, at least for many years now, been looking for a book that I could give to people who are excited about space, who hear that I'm working on it and want to know more, and will give them a, we think, rigorous but hopefully engaging introduction to what's going on. And we hope that this book will be that for a wide range of people. The blurb that we now have, I think, on the book jacket, I hope you like it because I think it's going to print tomorrow. So if you have any edits, please let me know immediately, is this. So your guide using the stories of change makers and the tools of economics to the transformation and future possibilities of the business and economics of space. And you see within those dashes, it's a combination of stories drawn from case studies that Brendan and I and other co-authors have written about space companies and agencies and programs. And then the tools of economics. It really is meant to be a book that brings economics to bear on the sector. So I'll say a lot more maybe about the book, but I thought actually before I keep talking, it would be nice to hear from all of you what you would like us to talk about. So we have, I don't know, an hour left at least. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that I can see you all really big. I'm just going to make a list. So what are some topics in space that you would really like to dig into that we can make sure we get to? Just raise your hand, your Zoom hand or your human hand, and then I can call on you to give us your thing. Or you can chat it in, I guess, if that's easier. Yeah, is it Amitabh or Utkarsh? I don't know.
Utkarsh, yes. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it.
Go ahead, Utkarsh.
I'm very interested in the concept of space race, and like US clearly has a lead, but what are you observing in other parts of the world? And are we going to see, a serious competition to the US come to fore?
Great. Okay. And sorry, I saw one in chat. Let me just bring that up. Okay, regulation of private space activities. Okay. Great, Michelle. Do you think we should we have it right? Should we have an international one? Starship, great, excellent.
Commercial
stations. Yes, that's a very good one. Great. That's from Mehdi, isn't it? Okay, excellent. Oh no, that's not from Mehdi. That's from Roger. Mehdi is areas of research and discipline. Okay, interesting. Mehdi, say more about what you mean by that one.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant mostly that the context is very interesting, and we are definitely there's a phenomenon. There are a lot of interest about the phenomenon. What I'm mostly interested in is how does it change the way we think about the disciplines and theories in management. Yeah, I would really like to know your ideas on that, and maybe I should add to my question, or what are the interesting questions that you'd like to see that people do research on and more activity on, which relates to the, probably it's not management scholar for practitioners, but management scholars for management scholars.
Excellent. Great. Okay. I don't normally get that question in presentations on space, so I appreciate that one. That's a good academic question. Okay. Remote sensing demand, right? Demand in general. Excellent. And mining. Excellent. Okay, good. Right. And ML, AI, and the future for space. Excellent. Okay. Okay. Anyone else? I've been watching the chat. Anyone hand up that wants to speak up? All right. Healthcare. Healthcare. In space? Is that what Preeti means there? Perhaps.
Maybe
All right.
at pharmaceutical, like
Could be.
or other possible industries that should involve now rather than later.
Yep. Yep. Great. Ah, yeah, that's what you mean. Great.
These are great questions.
Really great. And I love how they span a range from the very immediate to the very long term. And I think that's part of the magic of this sector, probably what brings us all to it as well. Excellent. Okay, great. Okay, great. Thanks for this list. We can keep those coming. You can keep, I guess, thumbs upping the ones that you're most excited about. We're gonna have plenty of time for Q&A as we come back. I wanted to show you a little bit how, Brendan and I are interested in, I think, literally every topic that you guys have listed here. And part of what we're trying to do with this book is put all of these questions into a rigorous framework that helps us organize our thinking. So I thought maybe that would be a useful thing to show you how we're thinking through that, and it'll give us hopefully also some nice insights even outside of these specific topics. Okay, so I'm sharing again. All right, so let me show you how in particular we're trying to use the tools of economics to do this. And so I'm going to start with what most economists, I think, and apologies to the economists on the call if this starts to feel a little bit elementary, but actually I think there's some really deep insights here if we think hard about it. So hopefully you'll be percolating on that in the back of your mind. And if you're not an economist, this might seem a little fast and a little quick, so I'm going to try to strike the right balance. Anyways, what's the most important idea in economics? So the most important idea in economics, I would argue, and I think most economists would agree, has this fancy name, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So I don't know how familiar a term that is to the folks on the call. But look, it sounds like an important idea, right, with a name like that. And so what is the first fundamental theorem? If you try to state it in normal English, it's something like this: under certain conditions, the equilibrium of a competitive market is efficient. And so, if you have heard about Adam Smith's invisible hand, or you have sort of free market friends out there, they're basically drafting off of this key idea. And it really is an incredibly powerful idea that the market economy, has a certain set of capabilities that, when structured correctly under certain conditions, uniquely yield an efficient allocation of resources. In other words, they uniquely maximize the size of the economic pie. This is such a deeply influential insight for a number of reasons: historical, theoretical, empirical. But I think it's actually really important for space. And I think to Brendan and me, it was a useful way to start thinking about how to structure our thinking. And that's for the following reason. Once you have this theorem in hand, you can break our activities in space, how we manage them, how we develop them, into really 3 buckets. And those form the 3 parts of the book. The first part is what we call establishing the market. It's about the decentralization of what has been a centralized space enterprise. And the reason this is part 1, the reason it comes from the theorem, is that I think most of us would probably agree the single most important change that's happened in the past couple of decades in the sector is the bringing in of market forces in a meaningful way, whether it's competition or efficiency or innovation in a decentralized manner. And because this fundamental theorem tells us that bringing in market forces is likely to push in the direction of efficiency, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for us in the sector that we've been leaving out in the past. And so the first step for all of us and for folks in this sector is to establish that market in space so we can tap in to that potential of market forces. Okay, part 2 notices that, of course, in this fundamental theorem, there is this first clause: under certain conditions, the market is efficient. And as much as we might get excited about the commercial revolution and the bringing in of market forces, we have to always keep in mind that, of course, markets are highly imperfect. And in fact, space has many, many market failures flowing all throughout it. So we're going to want to continue to have a robust and meaningful role for the public sector and for the state in space going forward. And we think of that as ways that you refine the market. So what can the state do in terms of regulation, like we heard, in terms of the provision of public goods, and so on, to make sure that the markets are working as well as they can to solve some of those situations in which those certain conditions don't hold. And then part 3 recognizes that even if you do those first 2 parts beautifully, that whole fundamental theorem is all about efficiency. It's just telling you how to maximize the size of the pie. But in fact, there's lots of other things we care about than maximizing the size of the pie. I mean, most obviously, we might care how we slice up that pie, but there's also other things we might care about that are even, in some sense, non-economic. And so how do we think about tempering the market if that's what we're doing, bringing market forces in, how do we think about tempering the market so that we're achieving the broader priorities we have for space, for society through space? Okay, so that's the reason we start with that framework. That's how we get these three parts, and it helps us organize lots and lots of specific things, many of which just came up in your interest in your topics, right? So you can see here the different chapters of the book. Each one of them has a story involved, many of them about specific companies, which you can see, or specific topics. And then it has tools or ideas or concepts attached to them that we think carry on beyond the individual story and tell you something fundamental about the sector and really economics and society more broadly. So I'm of course happy to talk about any and all of these specific ones, and Brendan will chip in when we do that. And so, you all can see some of the ones that you asked about in particular. We can just come back to them and hit them in the Q&A. But before we went there, I thought what I might do is dig a little bit. Oh, sorry, there's also a conclusion, an appendix. I thought we might dig in a little bit to part one, because I hope this would be interesting to you to see one of the things that we try to do in the book. And for me, it's actually made a pretty big difference, I found, in my ability to speak clearly to people who haven't spent much time thinking about space, about what's changing. And it really is leveraging some fundamental tools, again, in economics. Okay. In particular, I'm going to pull out the Swiss Army knife of economics on all of you and throw a supply and demand diagram at you. Okay, so Oguz, you can tell me on this call, what share of the people on this call are supply and demand aficionados, would you say? Are they excited about supply and demand? Is it familiar? Is it rusty? What would you say?
I think they are familiar with that, but it's always nice to
Review a little.
refresh
Sure.
their memories.
Brendan's smiling because I always ask students in class, I say, okay, how many of you recognize this? And of course, everyone raises their hand. And then I say, how many of you would like to come up and tell us about what it means? And then all the hands go down immediately. So, right, we all find ourselves in those situations. So, okay, that's great. So, okay, brief review of supply and demand. This is worth it even if we weren't talking about something as important as space, because supply and demand is really an incredible tool. Okay, so let's imagine this is a marketplace for something that you might think of as activity in space. So very broad, just we want to do stuff in space. This is the market for it. What supply and demand does is it plots the price of that activity versus the quantity of it in this marketplace. And it has these two relationships shown by these two lines. The orange one is the demand curve. And all it's saying is that as the price of space activity falls, so as you move down the vertical axis, you move out on the quantity axis, namely you go up in the quantity. As the price falls, more people want to buy stuff. The supply curve just tells you the opposite. As the price goes up, more people are willing to sell into this marketplace, right? Because they're getting a higher price for what they do. That's why there's a positive relationship. Now, for economists, the first thing about this relationship that's so powerful is, of course, that these lines cross. And so you can understand how a market is in a certain place or a certain equilibrium, as economists describe it, where there's a price and a quantity. You can discuss changes in that over time and so on. But it's actually got, I think, a much deeper meaning, and that's why it's so valuable. And that's what's reflected in the black text I've got here on these lines as well. So if you think about what the demand curve is really representing, at each point along this demand curve, it's telling you how much the purchaser values buying this good or service. So just to be specific, think about that point where supply and demand cross. The person on the demand curve at that point must value this space activity at exactly the price that corresponds to that point on the vertical axis. If they valued it at more than that, they would have been willing to buy at a higher price, so the demand curve would be higher at that point. And if they weren't willing to buy at that price, but had to go lower, then they wouldn't have bought and the demand curve would be lower at that point. And so you can use the demand curve to trace out the benefit at the margin for each person who's willing to buy space activities or whatever market you're in. And on the supply curve, it's the same thing, except it's the cost side. You can trace out the marginal cost to each person willing or each company willing to supply into this marketplace because you know it corresponds exactly to the price at which they were then willing to get into the marketplace. Okay, so why is this so useful? It's useful for a lot of reasons. One, which gets back to the first fundamental theorem, is that this marketplace that I've drawn here has a lot of those certain conditions that I mentioned in that theorem embedded in it. It's a well-functioning market in many ways. And so where supply equals demand is where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, or sorry, marginal cost equals marginal benefit. And that's the point at which we've maximized the net benefit we can get out of this marketplace. So the market, by getting us to equilibrium, automatically gets us to the place where we maximize the size of the economic pie. Okay, so that kind of reinforces that idea. But then it also lets us do all sorts of analysis about what's actually happening in the space sector. And again, this is like the simplest of all economic tools, but I think once you really use it, you can see some really powerful things. So let me just walk through a few slides there, and we'll touch on a few of the topics that you all asked about. So in particular, I think probably the reason most of us are interested in space or got interested in it is because of what's happened here. SpaceX is the prime mover, but lots of other things have also contributed to pushing the supply curve out. Namely, at any given quantity of space activity, the cost or the price has fallen. Or for any given price, we can do a lot more than we used to be able to do. In fact, I was just talking to a physicist here at Harvard this morning who's really involved in exploring in imaging black holes. You guys might know this guy, Peter Gallison, the whole M87 black hole image that all of us saw with all the petabytes of data, et cetera. So he's like the lead person on this, and he was talking about their next projects that they're trying to do to image the photon ring around black holes. And he was talking about the prices that NASA quotes for, or expects, the cost that NASA expects for putting a satellite up into MEO to do this kind of work. And he said they're still working with $1 million a kilogram. Right. Well, okay, $1 million a kilogram is really expensive. And the number of things that you can do in space is obviously constrained by that versus when the price comes down. And that's exactly, of course, what we've all been seeing in so many different ways, that when you push this blue curve out, you should be sliding down that orange demand curve to a higher quantity of activity. Right? That's the promise. But I think those of us who've been watching the space sector for the last several years at least, there's this gnawing concern at the back of our mind that we're not quite seeing the explosion of demand that we might have hoped would come about with this reduction in costs. And to make that a little more visual, you might say that we are worried that it looks a little bit more like this, that the demand curve kind of gets pretty steep around about where we are. Now, this is actually, I think, a great topic for debate as well. Like this is a great thing for our Q&A. Like, is that true? Or actually, are we seeing a lot of explosion in demand? Suffice it to say, I think that this is a really useful way to think about how we achieve the potential of space, no matter how curved you think this curve is at the moment. But if the curve did look, to the extent the curve does look like this, you can see what happens, that even when you lower costs, you get a little bit more quantity on the demand curve, a few more business cases close than before, but just not all that many. And it's kind of a bit disappointing. And so if that's the situation we find ourselves in, at least relative to our biggest hopes, what do we do about it, right? And what can be done and what can we do, like as people actually involved in this sector, to try to help shift this around? And here again, I think though this is such a simple tool, it gives us a few obvious ways to think about the various different efforts we're seeing and how they're going to make a difference. Okay, so let me show you the 3 ways that Brendan and I have thought about. One is to flatten out that demand curve again, or to make, again, demand more responsive to the falls in costs or reductions in price. Now, how does one do this? Of course, we'd like to have this happen. Well, there's an idea in economics which is much less well known than supply and demand, and it's this thing up in the title, the Le Chatelier effect. If you're a natural scientist, you might have heard of this because that's actually where it was first introduced, but economists grabbed it a few decades ago and started thinking about it as well. The basic statement of Le Chatelier is that the elasticity in response to price is smaller in the short run than in the long run, or the responsiveness to price is smaller in the short run and in the long run. Now, there's like a tinker toy, a very simplistic version of this, which is, of course, to any of us, if the price of something that we buy goes down, we might buy a little more of it, but it takes us a little bit of time to adjust, right? We've got our habits, we've got, things that we've already got as much of something as we need. So we might not respond as much today as we would over the long run. But Le Chatelier is a little bit more sophisticated than that. So think about the production function of a typical firm and suppose that I lower the cost of one of their inputs. Okay, so suppose that input is complementary to the other inputs in their production function, so that they're complements in production. So then those other inputs, as I buy more of that first one, the other inputs suddenly become more productive, right? That's what the complement means. So I'm going to want to buy more of those other inputs, right? So I buy more of those other inputs. But remember, those were complements to my first one. So now my first one also gets more productive again. And so I want to buy even more of that first one. So that's that they're complementary inputs. Now, suppose there's substitutes. So again, the price of my first input goes down. Okay, so I'm going to buy more of that input, right? Demand curve sloped down, so I want to buy more of that first input. Well, now if it substitutes with the other inputs, I'm going to buy less of the other inputs because they're now less productive, right? But if I'm buying less of those other inputs, then again, the productivity of my first one goes up. So I want to buy more again of that first input. And so whether we're talking about production substitutes or production complements, over time, I shift my production function towards the good that has fallen in cost. And it takes a while, right, for this to happen, for me to retool, retrain, all that kind of stuff inside my firms. And I think this is such an important insight because it mirrors so well, I think, what you see happening in some space sectors. So just think about Earth observation, for instance, right? We all kind of know the story of Planet, which is super exciting and like this amazing company. And its projections when it went public were really exciting and aggressive, and it's done very well relative to a lot of the companies that's backed. But on the other hand, if you look at their revenue growth curves, they have not continued to grow as fast as they thought. And I think that they're facing this challenge of how to make sure that they keep inspiring uses in different companies and at deeper levels. So they're trying to essentially accelerate this Le Chatelier effect. They're trying to help people figure out how to put it inside their production functions and then get this virtuous cycle going. So whether we're talking about Planet, which is one example, or Starlink, another great example, I mean, think of how few companies have truly integrated what Starlink can do for them into their production function. Like very, very few. And yet you see some of them getting up that curve pretty fast. Okay, so this is step one or option
Matt, can I
number
add
one.
something real quick?
Yeah, Brendan, please.
The one detail to add to that is that when you talk about Planet or Starlink and like the adoption of space technologies, broader adoption that could accelerate the Le Chatelier effect, one thing that we have seen is that there's all this enthusiasm around like normal businesses and normal users who could really benefit from space. I think when you look at it on paper, you see these capabilities and you say, boy, this could really be helpful to insurers or to governments or city planners or just regular businesses to monitor their supply chains for a capability like Earth observation, and then for connectivity like Starlink, you see all that. I think what we have seen is a shift or a big response in the drop in costs among like traditional space users. So folks like NASA, folks like the Department of Defense or intelligence communities or certain global governments or institutions that are used to working with space data. I think the real challenge where this demand curve is most pronounced is in the commercial use cases. And that's something that I think as people in the space industry, we all are desperately want to see, which is this could be so useful. There is so much potential value out there and real dollar value that could kind of accelerate the flywheel of commercial space activity. But I think just to put a fine point on it, I think that's so much like the core of the challenge of what we're talking about here. So back to you, Matt.
No, that's great. Please jump in whenever, Brendan. I'm sure I will miss things, and it's great to have two voices here. And I really echo that, especially you guys. I apologize, by the way, if you've ever seen a podcast Brendan and I have done, because we probably are repeating ourselves in a few points. But one thing that we often say is, if every Fortune 500, whatever, 2000, whatever, pick your group of companies, had just one senior person who was thinking about space and how it might change their business, what a huge step that could be forward, right? And I know there's lots of us, and obviously you guys at Oxford are working on that as well, just raising awareness and getting people to think about this. We think this would happen a lot faster.
Also,
Okay. Oh, yeah.
It would be nice to remind your paper called every company needs a space strategy now. I think it's very inspirational and important to read and like also imply to the real world. That like this discussion reminded me to that directly.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm so fortunate, right, to be at HBS where we have access to this Harvard Business Review platform where Brendan and I and a few other faculty here were able to get this message to a group of senior leaders at businesses all over the world to try to think about what their space strategy is and make it feel a bit like an imperative that if you don't do it, your competitors will do it. So don't delay. Great, thanks, Lagos. Okay, so that's just option one, right? And of course, there's things that companies can do. There's things that we can all do to try to get this to happen. But what other options are there? Well, if we go back to supply and demand, Another option would be to push this supply curve out even further. So here I've got this green line that pushes the supply curve out even farther. And then I've also changed, you can see I've drawn this other demand curve down a little bit lower. So what's going on here? Well, we don't know what the demand curve looks like. I mean, we can draw it on graphs all day, but we have no idea. And it could be that as you get to lower costs than where we've gotten so far, in fact, it does get quite a bit more responsive. That we just haven't, space is cheaper than it has been, but it's still not cheap in any grand sense. In fact, I was talking to somebody else the other day and we were talking about startups in space and how, when Brendan and I talk to HBS students who are trying to do their space startups, most of them have something to do with software or other things that are a lot less costly to think about starting up than some hardware based version of space, even though those costs have come down a lot. It's just pricey. So what if we really moved it down another order of magnitude? And of course, that's exactly the world we're in, right? With things like Starship pushing costs down another order of magnitude, you could imagine all sorts of things that make different activities in space dramatically cheaper. So one of you mentioned commercial stations. Great, right? We've never really had stations designed for commercial activity. If they could bring the costs of R&D and manufacturing down an order or two of magnitude as launch costs have come down, maybe all of a sudden business cases do start to make sense that never did before, even though we've been trying to think about this for 70 years. Satellite servicing is another great option, another great example of this. I mean, we think that's a little bit more kind of in the weeds, right? But the ability to service and refuel and otherwise maintain and improve our infrastructure up in space makes operating in space dramatically cheaper. And so you see a lot of investment by various companies and a lot of startups trying to imagine how they might help that servicing side of things. And this option can sound kind of overly optimistic, like why would we expect the curve to flatten out just if we get to lower costs? And here I would just suggest that there's, I think, an encouraging sign in Starlink, which is if you think about SpaceX, they get to charge themselves their own launch costs, which I presume are a lot less than they're charging their customers. And they think Starlink makes business sense. And evidence seems to be pointing that they're actually doing quite well with it. And so if that's true, that at those launch costs, they can make Starlink work, it does suggest to me that maybe some more options will open up as we push costs down further. Okay, so that's option 2. Brendan, did you have anything you wanted to? I'll just pause for a second now.
Just one other thing I wanted to add. You were mentioning how Starlink is evidence that as SpaceX pushes its own cost for launching Constellation is good evidence that yes, this can change a responsive demand. I'd make the same argument for Starship with space stations, where you've seen because the cost of a large heavy lift vehicle like Starship are so low, we've seen conversations between SpaceX and NASA actually saying, the costs on this are so low that this could actually be a great space station option. So it's just an example of lowering costs significantly, reinvigorating like creativity around, okay, like let's rethink how we can do this. So
yeah. And is it VAST that is designing its station for Starship? Is that right?
Starlab.
Starlab is now, that's right.
I mean, they sort of all are, but Starlab
sort of all are now.
Yeah,
that's right.
Starlab
right.
signed a contract.
That's right. Great. A good example. Okay. And then the third option I'll just mention is we haven't talked about the demand curve shifting. But of course, that's in some ways where the dreams are that get many of us involved in space, which is let's just create new sources of demand that actually are fine at the higher price points, right? But that just are hard for the market to create on its own, but that we can help to spur. And so this requires coordination. We can talk about how you might think about that coordination a little more formally, but here you get into the big push programs like Artemis or Mars, where we just don't have a market in these places until someone decides to coordinate activity around them as a focal point. And then all of a sudden, things that even are expensive start to make business sense for the companies involved. Okay, so those are the 3 main options that, as I think about the various things going on in space, it's helpful for me to bucket them into these. And as I talk to people about how can we make the potential for space be realized, I encourage them to think about which of these 3 things are they helping make happen, right? Are they helping to get more people to use space more deeply? Are they helping to lower costs even further? Or are they creating new sources of demand? It's a simple, but I think hopefully helpful framework for thinking through that. I'll briefly just mention, so that's like a taste essentially of what we try to do in part one of the book. There's other tools, there's other concepts that I think get into really interesting parts of space. You can see in chapter 4, planet, supply and demand. You can imagine we're doing a lot of what I just did here through chapter 4, but then there's some other stuff in the rest of it. In part 2, we really do talk about the role for government, and here I'm thinking about the comments on regulation in space. So we're happy to talk about whether it's space debris or antitrust or spurring development through subsidization to startups, et cetera. Happy to talk about those aspects in refining the market. And then in tempering the market, things like property rights. So who's going to actually benefit from space and how do we think about ownership in space? And of course, national security, which is a topic that I've certainly over time learned one can't really think seriously about space without spending some real time thinking seriously about that side of it. And especially in today's geopolitical context, how are we understanding the progress of space and what it's going to lead to in that sense? Okay, so I think that's all I have for you to share. Here's a cool part of the book where we've interviewed a few really important space leaders and asked them for their thoughts on space. That's a fun little treat at the end of the book. But fundamentally, we hope that this book will help all of us do this important work of space, and we hope you guys will pick up a copy. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and we can do some Q&A and talk about whatever you want. So,
Perfect.
okay.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yeah.
It was a great presentation, and sounds great, your book, and I'm so excited to have it as soon as it's released. One thing before everyone starts asking their questions, I really wonder your opinion about the graphic that you have showed. The dream that having both supply and demand is going forward, right? Also, we have a limitation in the space industry, not like the other industries. For example, physical limitations are a big issues especially for the satellite industry, right? Because a company create a satellite, let's say communication satellite, they send it to the orbit, but it takes 3 years, and in those 3 years, new technology comes, and as soon as they send it out, the technology will become obsolete anyway. So I think we have also physical limitation in the space industry. So everyone wants to hear, it should be profitable, but it's not like a car industry or any other industry, right? It's like space. So I don't know how we are responsible of convincing people in terms of the reality of the industry, but I really wonder your take on that.
Great, and I'll start, but this is a great topic for us all to discuss. This should all be like a general discussion. It shouldn't be ping pong back and forth with me. I think there's a couple things underneath your question. So one risk of the timelines you're talking about is that terrestrial substitutes for something that seemed doable in space develop while we are trying to do the thing in space. And so space station manufacturing is a classic example of this, right? We might think microgravity is really awesome to do some new crystal. We start trying to build it out on a station. It's going to take 5 years to figure out the technology. Turns out in those 5 years, we figured out a way to do something very similar on Earth at a thousandth of the price, right? So that is a real challenge. And I think that's hurt a lot of potential space businesses over the years. The second thing you might be talking about is just that even if that wouldn't happen, the financing of space businesses is just hard because it takes long and VC has short horizons. And so it's just impatient. I think that is true. I think that the VC sector knows that that's a problem. I think the financial sector knows that's a problem. And if any sector is creative at finding ways to capture value, I think it's the financial sector. So I tend to think that if it's a truly good business plan, it's likely to still get funded. And certainly we've seen that's how financiers talk about it with our students as well, that it's not like it was in the frothy days of zero interest rates and SPACs, but if you've got a real idea, they can figure out a way to get you the money. But I think the third thing is just, is it is it impossible to move fast enough in space to kind of capture the technological frontier and really make money? And I guess I'm a little more optimistic than maybe the question implies, in the sense that I feel like we're getting better at designing things that stay at the frontier, whether it's because they're more software based, so you can update them just at the speed of light, or whether it's that the costs have come down, that you can just throw the thing away and put something new up if you need to, especially a cheaper launch. So, Brendan, did you want to?
One thing I wanted to add is that I think one of the central themes of our book is that space, the way we think of space at least, is really just a place. It's a place where through certain technologies that will change over time, you can capture value and bring that value down for people. So the way that we think about space is not dissimilar how we think of any other place where humans touch, where there's a role for public and private sectors and where businesses will compete to try to capture value. I think that vision of space is, the same as every other industry or geographic area, whatever you want to call it, is definitely in tension with what you were saying. The reality is that under the current approach to space today, where you have to fund your business, and then let's say you're a satellite business, build your satellites, build your team, acquire a launch vehicle 2 years before the actual launch itself, and finance that, and then get on orbit, and then all that stuff. There are definitely challenges that a typical, let's say, hardware-rich space business faces that some other businesses, especially terrestrial ones, don't face. What I think one response to that would be for us to be get on our high horse and say, well, we face so much harder challenges as the space industry than a typical earthly industry. Like we're completely different, and we couldn't possibly be expected to play on the same playing field. I think the inverse of that, and maybe the approach we should strive for, is saying, you know what, if we're going to be in an industry that's driven largely by market forces, we've got to meet customers where they are. We got to compete just like every other industry, and that requires really creative solutions and kind of a first principles approach to solving those problems. I think if you look at SpaceX's approach to launch, they didn't start with saying, okay, we're the space industry, what's a reasonable cadence that we should be launching our rockets? They said, okay, if we want to bring forth a technology that really is relevant to normal people and relevant to changing the trajectory of this industry, we got to launch these things a lot, because we can't have these years-long development cycles. I think that's an approach we've seen work. So that's what I'll add.
Great. Thank you.
How would you like to do the Q&A, Oguz? Do you want me to run through topics? Do you want to call on people? What would you like to do?
Please, yeah, feel free.
All right. Brendan, why don't we do like a tag team here? Like, I'll suggest one, you think about one, and I'll suggest. Does that sound good?
Yeah,
Okay.
all these questions are great.
They are great, and it's hard to figure out which one to talk about first. Okay, so actually, I was, of course, I was starting at the end of the chat, so apologies. We'll work our way back up. But I'd love to talk a little bit about this Mehdi's most recent one, where he talks about the market, perfect competition, monopoly, oligopoly, especially because it connects also to national security and to a much earlier question about regulation of the sector. And I think it's a really important question. First of all, the observation is absolutely right, Mehdi, that, I mean, the market was monopolistic, or maybe oligopolistic if you think of defense and NASA as separate in the US. And then, of course, there's a few international agencies and national security establishments too. So not many buyers. And not many suppliers. So it's sort of a monopoly pairing. And, actually that kind of worked really quite well for a number of years to accomplish the sorts of things we needed to accomplish when we were trying to serve public goods goals and some national security goals. And you're right that the analysis that I drew, those graphs, there's like embedded within it kind of this idea of perfect competition where there isn't this sort of market power. And so I guess I'd say two things. The first is that if we are really going to capture the benefit of bringing in the commercial forces, we have got to prioritize competition. I don't think we have to do that in the manner of slowing down those who are doing really well, right? So like there's a lot of worries in the sector right now that like SpaceX has become a monopoly, and it's really hard to compete. And so what does that mean, right? Should we try to pull back, like break up SpaceX or something like, is going on with Google? I'm skeptical of that in the sense that when you're trying to think about antitrust regulation, like the classic economic question is, are they creating value or are they just capturing value, right? And it seems really hard to me anyways, not to see SpaceX creating like tremendous value still. And especially with Starship, it seems like they are just still going full steam ahead to try to create value in the sector. Of course, they could always turn around and just try to become a value capturer, but doesn't seem anyways like they've gotten there yet. Instead, what I think we'd all like to see, and what I think the DoD, Department of Defense, NASA, and other agencies are trying to do is just make sure that there are other companies getting some support to try to be fast followers for SpaceX and eventually cause competition or keep competition alive for them, so that the basic insight of a sort of perfect competition analysis will still carry through even if it's not actually a perfectly competitive industry, right? That like we will get some of the benefits from the competition, even if we're still in a relatively concentrated sector, given all the fixed costs. So I don't know, Mehdi, did you want to follow up on that? I mean, did I get at your question or?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a follow-up is, that was actually very educational. Thank you very much. I was just wondering also when you look at the numbers, like we are talking about DoD like 20 billion budget versus NASA 20 something budget, that a fraction of that fuels the new space sector or the competitive space sector. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. That it seems like we are talking about a fraction of a market.
That's an amazing question, right? Rebecca's getting in on the same point actually in the chat, for sure, right? I mean, the Pentagon's budget is so big, right, almost $1 trillion, that it can seem overwhelming. Of course, most of that's not space. I mean, if you look at like direct space spending, it's a fraction of that, but it's still bigger than NASA's budget. And we certainly see, talking to startups, that national security, especially in a tighter capital market environment, is a real lifeline and maybe even a dominant target for what they're trying to produce. And I think you're right that there are real questions to be asked there. In fact, there was another question in the chat, which is like, should we worry about the militarization kind of the space sector and what it'll mean for the long-term cooperation in space and all those sorts of things? I think those are really big issues. We can talk more about them later. I guess what I'll just say for now is that I think the tension you're talking about is if the more weight national security priorities carry in the development of the commercial sector, the more you might worry that the development gets skewed away from stuff that will actually be commercially viable and valuable. That's certainly a risk. It seems to me that NASA has certainly tried to retain this kind of one customer among many approach as it's gone forward these last many years, and we'll see. Hopefully they'll continue to do that. There's some concerns, I think, about whether they will. And I would hope that the Department of Defense and others would have a similar way of thinking about this, which is like, we want you to develop stuff for national security, but we do hope that you're also thinking about how to sustain yourself commercially. That, I think, is the biggest advantage of, say, the US national security establishment. And so I wouldn't want them to forget about that. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Brendan, you're up. You can talk about that too if you want. I know that's,
sure.
that's
yeah. I mean, we could talk all day about that. For me, a key question about is this a good or a concerning thing is, are these Department of Defense and intelligence communities dollars helping space businesses move down their cost curves that allow them to bring similar technologies to bear for commercial customers or other customers? Is a good example of that is SpaceX. They very aggressively early on went after launch contracts for the Department of Defense. It was critical dollars for them at an early vulnerable stage for the company. The same could be said for Planet, for a host of other young and scrappy companies. So far, we have seen many instances in which, yes, this is a pool of money that is very helpful, as Matt said, often a lifeline for young companies that otherwise have fairly few options. And we have seen that it translates into capabilities that are broader than just national security. It's not just for fighting and winning wars. Does that change going forward? Do we see more and more startups that are funding these days, seeing the trends in DoD dollars? I'll give a data point. The CAP the Department of Defense has a program where they're buying connectivity services, and the cap on that just was raised from like 700 million to like 13 billion. It was just news the other day. So in response to that, do we a host of space companies now that are exclusively gunning for the Department of Defense, and that value doesn't spill over to other uses? That for me would be that'd be something we'd have to watch a little bit more carefully, or that I'd be less excited about as someone who's rooting for a space economy that doesn't just benefit a few concentrated interests. So anyway, it's a really good question, and one that I hope we talk a lot more about. One question I want to tackle was Benjamin's question, which is how will Starship alter the investment ecosystem? I think that's fascinating. I think it is really the question. Shape, if there was one thing, one set of activities that is determining that pivot point that Matt was showing earlier of, which way is the demand curve going to bend? I think it is really not only the progress of Starship itself, but also the market's reaction to it. So what is it? First, there's the development of Starship itself. How fast can they do it? How quickly can they get customers? What does it mean for SpaceX and the capabilities SpaceX can bring? Second order effect would be, to what extent does that ripple throughout the space industry? We've seen a few forward-thinking startups really optimize around a Starship solution. A good example is K2, a satellite bus manufacturer that's focusing on building Starship-sized satellites. Most satellites and satellite architectures are not optimized for a rocket the size of a Sequoia. They're optimized for much more normal rockets. So how quickly can the space industry respond and fully utilize the additional value that space is bringing to bear with Starship? That's a key question for me. And then like the further out ripples would be, what does the investment community think of this? To what extent does this raise real awareness in not just our little bubble here, but beyond? One thing that I'm really encouraged by is this is front page news in a lot of places, not just on Space News, but in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. This is something that I think is resonating. The outside community is getting a much better understanding of what's really happening in space and what matters. Although it's still frustrating sometimes to see, after what I would consider a very successful Starship test flight, that the headline is, oh, another explosion, another stumble for the Starship program. And you're like, oh my God, that's not how this works. But anyway, we're getting there. So that is a key watch item for me. And Ben, I think that's a great question.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I love the point about attention to Starship, because if you think about the attention to the Apollo programs back in the 60s and what that meant for a generation of people, whether it's Jeff Bezos or less prominent folks who went into space and STEM because of that, I imagine that's happening now. Certainly we see it even at the business school. I'm sure you guys see it at Said as well. I mean, hey, people on this call are probably a good example. Okay, I'll take a related set of questions. So Roger asked about commercial station sustainability. And Alan asked about mining. So a couple of like those ideas that have literally been around since the 70s as where we would go next in space. And, how do we think about that? Or how to, so I think some skepticism is always good, actually, at some level, when you're talking about these more speculative business cases in space. Certainly, Brendan and I always try to emphasize to folks that we think over the next 5-10 years, our focus really from a business standpoint should be on data through and from space and how we're going to make the most of the value that can create. But I'm on the relatively optimistic end of the spectrum for these two things over the long term. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why. I think, first of all, the point that Brendan was alluding to, that we alluded to as well with the falling costs, I think it's really hard actually to forecast based on past evidence what the future is going to look like when the technology is changing so dramatically for what one might do on a station and what one might do in terms of mining relative to what was possible before. The second is that I think the greatest, and this is in some sense one of the other key, I hope, lessons of the book and the research. Brendan mentioned one, that space is just a place where we're all going to be actors. Another is that one of the great things about markets is you can't actually predict them very well. That's like the great magic of decentralized innovation. And when I think about some of the companies who are doing commercial station work these days, so like VAST is a great example, right? So you get this, you get the CLD contracts with Axiom, which is like almost like a pseudo legacy player, right? Like it's super connected to NASA. It's got all sort of these legacy people involved. You get some more outside the box ones like Starlab, which is sort of connected to a various set of commercial players. And then you get VAST coming up kind of out of nowhere, not even in the CLD contracts. And now they're still kicking and like trying to do stuff. Similarly on asteroid mining, 10, 15 years ago, you get Planetary Resources, you get Deep Space Industries trying to do things. They're too early or whatever, that doesn't quite work out. But now you get Astroforge, which raises 13 million to try to do this again. Are either VAST or Astroforge going to succeed? I don't know, right? They might still be too early. There might still not be a business case. But I love the fact that the market is finding ways to fund some of these really speculative ventures to make it happen. And when you listen to them, they're not really even talking so much about finding ways to like close the business case in a intermediate way, right? Like Planetary Resources used to say, look, we're going to service Earth and then eventually we'll mine some asteroids. Astroforge is like, we're just mining asteroids, people. Like that's the goal here. And I think that's fantastic. Like that is what markets do, especially when they attract more and more talent to a sector like this. And eventually I think we will find ways to break through in ways that right now we can't even imagine. That it's the optimistic side of me again, but I think that's the whole point actually of getting the market involved.
And one thing I wanted to add is that even if, let's say, a VAST or an Astroforge fails, I think sometimes people see that as a blow, and like, we're delaying the dreams by another 5-10 years. What I see is that all the people who work at a space station company or a space mining company, for the extent that they've been focused on that, they've been trained in pursuing a specific goal and advancing certain technologies. So every time I see a space company going after an ambitious vision, even if I think it's going to be tough sledding for them, I think, okay, we're that much closer. There's some 25-year-old somewhere who's been working really hard on trying to mine an asteroid. And if they don't do it with this company, they'll do it with the next one. They'll do it with the next rocket or something like that. So if the idea is good, I think capitalism gives us reasons to believe in the promise of the future.
Totally. Can I just add, let me just add a couple more things on mining, because I was looking through the chat. In terms of property rights, if you don't already know about sort of the 2015 act that law that the United States passed, giving US companies the right to own and sell mined resources from space, take a look at that. We have a chapter in the book that talks all about it. And it's a really interesting story. Actually, Planetary Resources had Peter Marquez leading their efforts to help Congress figure out how to craft a law that would abide by the Outer Space Treaty, but still give US companies the right to mine resources and profit off of them. And so that's a really interesting story. And I think that to the extent you can ever settle international law when in the absence of the actual activity, I think it is pretty much settled. We'll see, like once someone actually starts mining these resources, whether there's a new debate, but it seems like that's gonna be allowed. And then the only other thing I would just add on to what Brendan said, I love that point actually, right? That you get people trained up and then they go on to other companies to do it, is the other place we haven't talked much about is the moon. And with the mining of resources on the moon, there's going to be I think we're going to do this, right? We're going to try to mine water ice. We're going to try to mine helium-3, and like we'll learn a lot about how to do it better. And potentially that will have lots of benefits in other contexts. Okay, Brendan, did you have another one you wanted to jump on?
Sure. I had one quick follow-up to what you're talking about, because you touched on property rights. I think there's a ton of great questions about that would fall into what we call like temper the market. Really big kind of fundamental and even philosophical questions about what is the future of space activities mean? How does it reinforce or challenge some of the beliefs that we have? As you might have seen in the table of contents that Matt showed, we chose to focus on two. The property rights in space, so space mining, and the intersection of national security and commercial space as we see it today. But I mean, those are just two out of really an infinite number of really deep and important questions concerning like what is the future of space mean? How does it challenge what we're doing? How can we use and channel this energy to create a future that we're truly more excited about in every possible way? We focused on two. We really, really hope that as a result of reading the book and more conversations like this, that more people will dig into those other sections that we did not examine in the book. So I just wanted to add on to that because there's so much work to be done. I'm scrolling through the questions here.
Oh, I got one I can jump on. Well, you find one. Okay, so David McCord asked about the U.S. election. That's definitely on our minds over here, I can tell you, given how soon it is. I guess my initial, well, boy, it's hard to predict just about anything about the U.S. election and its impacts. Space has remained blissfully nonpartisan. I don't know if our friend Mr. Musk is going to change that with his activities, but I think that the central role that space plays in so much of our lives, whether it's national security or civilian or increasingly commercial, means that it's pretty hard for any administration to kill the goose that's laying golden eggs. So I would hope that space will chart a relatively similar path, just no matter who wins. I think one question which we've heard from NASA folks or people who've recently moved on from NASA is that as the CLPS contracts with going to the moon have their stumbles, one might say, I think there is some questions about whether sort of the public sector will stay the course on bringing in the commercial sector, or whether we'll start to move back towards a more concentrated model. And you could imagine that's different players, right? It's probably, maybe it's not the old legacy contractors, but SpaceX is now a legacy contractor and we've just recycled the names, but the same structure. I think both the Harris and Trump administrations would be relatively supportive of commercial space, but my guess is that certainly the people we talked to who were in the Trump administration first time felt very supported in terms of the commercial space sector. And so I would expect that to be a relatively sanguine outcome for the space sector.
There's one question here from, I think it's Michele, that I think actually, Matt, we could tag team, which is a really good question. Do you think we should have an international institution for regulation? We do have one. We have several, depending on which facet of the space industry you're talking about. For most general questions, you have the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which created the fundamental set of space laws in, I believe it was 1967. Do I have that right? Then so that's kind of the foundational level. Then of course you have the International Telecommunications Union, which manages really important things like spectrum. That I think spectrum doesn't get as much general attention as it should. It's hugely important and really even contentious these days, which is always kind of fun when that gets brought up. But more to your point, I think that as we look at different challenges that the space ecosystem as a whole faces, for example, space debris, they are very tough challenges to solve through unilateral action, where you really need cooperation and coordination across a whole wide number of space actors. And of course, when you have like, let's call it half of the space activity happening in one part of the world and half of it happening in another, and the two parts of the world don't really like each other and don't even talk, that causes real problems. So I do think that for certain problems, for certain market failures, I should say, where you need coordination and cooperation to solve them, I think we do have some work to do. The lessons from climate change show us that that's really not easy, and especially since there's a military element, or at least a sensitive element to so much of what happens in space today. I think it's especially hard when it comes to space, but I don't think that means we shouldn't try and that we shouldn't keep speaking loudly about the things we think are dangerous for the future of space. So I'll leave it there, Matt. I know you'll probably have a much more sophisticated perspective on that.
Well, no, I think that was very well said. It's very hard to predict because, of course, we don't have a global government. I think the one thing, some of you have probably heard of these ideas that we talk about in the book. I'll just mention them in case you haven't. There's this thing called the Coase theorem. Ronald Coase, this really famous economist. How can the private sector basically coordinate in the absence of a government to solve some of these market failures? And then there's a political scientist who won the Nobel Prize in economics named Elinor Ostrom, who had this idea called polycentric governance, which is, again, how can private actors coordinate in the absence of either well-functioning markets or states? And so we talk about both of those in the context of space debris in particular, but of course it has broader applicability. You might think that space is actually a great place where, even in the absence of a global government, people will figure this out. Like, there aren't that many space actors of significance, and so all of them have an interest in it not getting ruined. Can't we figure out a way to make this happen? But that's complicated, of course, by geopolitics. And it's not entirely clear that there aren't actors in the system that would be just fine with actually lowering the net value that it has to Earth if they thought that it would create a substantial advantage for them. So I think Brendan's exactly right that that's the big risk. I'm more optimistic just because I think that the value is huge, and so the incentives to get this figured out are really large. But we will see. It's hard to predict, and I think, Mary Christine, I saw your recent chat about both the property rights debates. You're absolutely right that we will see whether, in fact, those who are opposed to the US 2015 law get a voice once the actual property rights gets tested or not. And then also the interesting point around, like, Greg and Peter Navarro's thinking about the space program and how it relates to the US presidential election. I mean, it's a tricky thing, right? Because on the one hand, there's I think you're right, those voices would be very pro commercial space, but they're also not particularly sanguine about the relationship with China. And so it's hard to know exactly how those things would net out. Okay, I had a totally different one. So Preeti asked about healthcare for space settlements. I can't resist talking about this one. I love this. So here's one of the Brendan and I see eye to eye on so many things, but this is one where we've had a long historical debate where I really want people up in space, and he's happy with it just being robots. No, I'm caricaturing his view, but we can talk more about this. So Preeti, I am a big fan of putting more people in space for longer periods of time, and that would, of course, require lots of improvements to healthcare and maybe even to humans, so that we can survive up there. And so I tend to think that it's not just a desire of mine to put people up there, but it's like inevitable. People are just too focused on exploration, or at least a small share of the Earth's population is going to want to do this. And so I would love to see more of that activity. In fact, of course, there's also just going to be demand for it if we have more national security activities up there, if there's more people on commercial stations, if space tourism becomes not just up and back, but actually going around for a while, or even staying in a hotel or something for some time. We're going to need to start to be able to do serious healthcare up there, whether it's remote surgery or otherwise. And so, yes, I think that's definitely a growth area. And there are people I know, like at Harvard Medical School, who are working on this and various other places as well. So.
Matthew, we have last 5 minutes or
Yep.
so. I want to ask one question before we ended up this. So what is your suggestion for the social science people like us? Because you have experience for more than anyone else here, and you inspired me with your essay called Final Economic Frontier. And everyone who has some interest into space want to involve as a part of a company, right? So what do you think about the next 2-3 years, which industries you think will focus on more space industry or should, And also, what's your suggestion to us? Like, how can we convince them to open a position for, like you mentioned earlier, like a senior space expert in their company, so they can be part of this race? So,
Great. Okay. Those are really important questions. I'm not sure I have great answers. Well, Brendan and I'll both take a shot at them maybe. So in terms of, where do I imagine a lot of growth coming? Here's what I would suggest, especially for the short term. I think Earth observation, I hope, right? Like I hope remote sensing and all that takes off. I hope we can find more applications. People have been trying to figure that out for some time, and I don't know. I'd like to remain optimistic, but I think that that's going to require a lot of creativity. The thing that I think is a little more potentially reliable is internet and connectivity through space. I think that's going to explode. I think a couple of questions we didn't get to are about AI and its implications for space. I think if you forecast out the demand for compute, the demand for power, just the potential knock-on effects of the growth of AI and how space almost inevitably is going to be a big part of solving maybe all, but certainly some of those problems, and also taking advantage of what it would mean to have mobile connectivity at scale with AI. That's where I would be thinking about applications. So any company that is going to benefit from mobile connectivity in a big way and could try to be a leader in it that's where I would try to slot in. Brendan, I'll let you jump in a second. But as you're thinking about that, the other question that got asked, and it was both you, Oguz, but also Mehdi earlier on, which is implications for social science research and management research and things like that. And I'll just say, this is not easy. So like I started thinking about space 10 years ago, and I have been trying to find great topics to study in space. And of course, I think there are some, but Brendan said something that I thought was maybe the best thing about this, which is space is just a place. And so I always discourage people from becoming like a space economist or like a space whatever, because I just don't think that makes sense. I mean, you can become a Latin American economist or whatever, like you focus on Latin America, that's great, but you're fundamentally an economist applying your tools to Latin America. And I think it's the same with space. So I would focus on whatever you're most passionate about in the social sciences and then see if there's a really cool opportunity to study it in space rather than the other direction. So I don't know, Brendan, did you want to hop in on the first one?
I mean, that's a great last word. So if you want to end it there, that's great.
All right, cool. Great.
well, thank you so much then for both of you for your time and interest, and also especially for our participants who are listening and asking great questions. So I feel like we have so many important topics to study more. So I feel like I have so many homework right now. But thank you so much for your time again, and hopefully see you next time.
Great. Thanks for the invitation, everybody. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for all the great questions. Best of luck. All right. Bye.
Thank you.